In the heart of the most powerful empire in the world, when Rome shone with unbreakable strength and Marcus Aurelius seemed to have everything under control, an invisible shadow arose that would change everything. It was not an invasion. It was not a war. It was not the barbarians who first broke the backbone of the empire. It was something smaller, quieter, and deadlier. Between the years 165 and 180 AD, a plague swept through the cities, the fields, the roads of the empire. It did not distinguish between soldiers or emperors, slaves or senators. In just a few years, between 5 and 10 million people disappeared. The Roman legions crumbled. Cities emptied. Temples filled with desperate prayers. And the philosopher-emperor, Marcus Aurelius, wrote in tears, "All that we love is doomed to perish." This is the story of a pandemic forgotten by many, yet one that marked the beginning of Rome's end. Stay, because you are about to discover how a simple disease weakened the greatest empire in history. Imagine an empire at the height of its power. The legions return triumphant from the east, their standards waving in the wind, but they do not bring only glory, they bring death. The Antonine Plague, also known as the Plague of Galen, was not just an illness, it was a dark storm that shattered the heart of the Roman Empire. Its name comes from the dynasty of the Antonine emperors, but its origin is lost among screams of agony and unanswered prayers. The symptoms were brutal: burning fever, uncontrollable diarrhea, swollen throat, and on the 9th day, the skin erupted in pustules. Those who survived were scarred for life. Those who did not, became numbers, ashes, silence. Even the emperor Lucius Verus fell ill, perhaps a victim of this scourge. And while Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, wrote reflections on the fleeting nature of life, Rome began to forget what it was like to live without death on its streets. The doctors were helpless. No one knew how to stop the plague. Neither gold, nor the sword, nor the gods of the pantheon could halt it. Only one man dared to confront the inexplicable. Galen, the most influential physician of antiquity, described the plague, fought it as best he could, and unknowingly left a legacy that would survive 1,000 years. But for millions of Romans, none of this mattered. All they knew was uncertainty. And the smell of death at every corner. How much pain can a number measure? According to the most conservative estimates, the Antonine Plague killed 10% of the Roman Empire's population. That means 7.5 million people. But some estimates speak of a third of the empire's inhabitants wiped off the map. Men, women, children, soldiers, philosophers, merchants, slaves. Imagine that in the 2nd century, Rome had about 75 million people. It would be as if today nearly 800 million human beings vanished in just a few years. The scale is apocalyptic. The cities were hit the hardest. Overcrowding, poverty, stagnant waters and open sewers made them an incubator of hell. The once invincible army fell to its knees. In some camps, 15% of the soldiers perished. The countryside, more isolated, suffered less, but was not spared. Numbers are cold, but behind each one was a life cut short. A child without a father. A mother without children. An old man who died alone because no one remained to bury him. Makeshift graves multiplied. Temples filled with prayers carried away unanswered by the wind. And meanwhile, birth rates collapsed. Life expectancy fell to 20 years. In some cities, the death rate surpassed the birth rate, and the empire had to sustain its population through slavery and forced immigration. The plague did not only kill bodies. It began to erode the very structure of the empire. In silence, without armies, without wars, without catapults. Only with fever, wounds, and pustules. That proud, expansive empire began to shrink. To grow weaker. Less eternal. Rome was the epicenter of the ancient world. An emporium of architecture, power, and sophistication. But it was also, ironically, the perfect breeding ground for death. Its cities, especially the capital, were overcrowded, dirty, and poorly ventilated. At the empire's heart, more than 1 million people lived crammed together, sharing tiny rooms, contaminated water, and stale air. Epidemics were not strangers to antiquity. But none, until then, had struck with the violence of the Antonine Plague. And it did so because Rome had built the perfect trap for itself. The sewers were ancient but insufficient. Drinking water came through the famous aqueducts, yes, but it was easily contaminated with human and animal waste. Slaves, arriving by the tens of thousands after each military campaign, suddenly swelled the urban population, displacing wage workers and living in inhuman conditions. Hospitals were scarce, and medicine relied more on superstition than on science. Most doctors had no idea how to prevent contagion. The concept of isolation did not exist. People died in their beds, and their bodies were carried out through the same door where newborn children entered. Meanwhile, the elite sought refuge in their country villas, far from the stench, far from the cries, far from the suffering. But not even they were safe. The plague respected neither class, nor titles, nor lineage. The great Roman paradox: the richer it was, the more vulnerable. The more connected, the more exposed. The more civilized, the more defenseless against an invisible enemy. Rome had built a flawless network of roads, unified by land and sea. A logistical marvel for trade, and also for disease. Every cart, every ship, every legion was an artery through which the plague spread with fury. The plague needed no army. No pacts, no conspiracies. It only needed Rome to breathe. And Rome breathed. Deeply. And it was poisoned. As Rome burned with fever, its frontiers groaned under the pressure of relentless enemies. For the plague did not only take peasants, merchants, or senators. It devoured the army itself, the beating heart of the empire. The Roman legions, disciplined, imposing, invincible, began to fall one by one, not on the battlefield, but in the barracks, coughing blood, their skin covered in black blisters, writhing in fever and vomiting. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, wise and stoic, faced a cruel paradox. He needed soldiers to repel enemies along the Rhine and the Danube, but his men were dying before they could even wield a sword. The famous Marcomannic War, in which Germanic tribes crossed the northern borders, became a hopeless struggle. Rome no longer had healthy reserves. They recruited slaves, peasants, even criminals, handing many a sword with no training, no armor, no hope. The ranks filled with desperate men, and the standards of the legions, once symbols of world order, began to crumble, like civilization itself. Even so, Marcus Aurelius did not yield. He carried the weight of the empire on his shoulders while writing in his journal, Meditations, reflections that reveal the pain of a man trying to preserve reason in the midst of collapse. But neither his philosophy nor his courage could stop the inevitable. The most perfect war machine of antiquity was rotting from within, eaten away by a disease that knew no borders, no mercy. Rome still stood, but its foundations trembled. For the war was not outside, it was inside. In the lungs of its soldiers. In the coughs that turned into final sighs. In the silent camps where the enemy was invisible, but lethal. When prayers failed, and the gods remained silent before temples filled with corpses, Rome turned to its last resource, science, or at least what passed for it in the 2nd century. It was then that Galen appeared, the most brilliant physician of his time, urgently summoned to the capital by emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. He had been born in Pergamon, a Greek city where temples stood beside libraries, and his mind was a rare combination of anatomical knowledge, philosophical logic, and human compassion. But even Galen, with all his treatises and dissections, faced a darkness with no name and no cure. He observed, recorded, compared symptoms, and documented a pattern: fever, sore throat, violent diarrhea, and on the 9th day, skin eruptions with pustules. Many today believe it was smallpox. Others, measles. But at the time, it was simply death wearing another face. Galen did something few physicians of his age dared: he separated the sick from the healthy, ordered hand-washing, and promoted rudimentary containment measures. To us, these are obvious. To the Roman world, they were revolutionary acts. And yet, he himself knew his efforts were only a drop in a dark ocean. Medical knowledge was limited, superstition ran rampant, and resources were scarce. Still, his legacy transcended the tragedy. His writings outlived the Roman Empire itself, and for over 1,000 years, Europe continued to teach medicine illuminated by his words. The plague spared no one, but Galen endured as a faint beacon in the fog, documenting terror with the pen of one who understood that knowledge, even if it cannot cure, is the first step toward hope. The Antonine Plague left more than bodies in the streets, it left missing numbers in censuses, abandoned farms, silenced workshops, and a shattered trade network. Though estimates vary, the most accepted figures suggest that 10% of the empire's population perished, about 7.5 million people. But that number was only the beginning of the disaster. In the cities, where the poor lived crammed together under poorly ventilated roofs, mortality reached 15%. The armies suffered even greater losses. In contrast, in isolated rural zones the plague had less impact, but not enough to sustain the empire's structure. Rome, which had once reached a population peak of 75 million, never fully recovered. Falling birth rates, high infant mortality, and the collapse of trade routes created a perfect storm. To make matters worse, the forced migration of slaves brought in from military campaigns, many sick or immunologically vulnerable, exacerbated the crisis. The city of Rome itself, which had once held more than 1 million souls, slowly began to suffocate in its own decadent glory, with too few active citizens to sustain its scale. It was a silent decline, imperceptible in daily life, but devastating in the decades that followed. As if the plague not only killed bodies, but severed the vital arteries of an empire that had believed itself eternal. The Antonine Plague did not only take lives, it took the soul of a dynasty. During the first years of the epidemic, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus ruled as co-emperors. Both had been trained in Stoic virtue and in the ideal of the philosopher king. But nothing in philosophy had prepared them for an invisible enemy that bled the empire dry without swords or armies. Lucius Verus died in 169, supposedly a victim of the plague. Marcus Aurelius, shaken but steadfast, ruled alone until 180. His reign was the last spark of the 5 good emperors. But his death not only marked the end of an era, it signaled the beginning of a tragedy. He was succeeded by Commodus, his biological son, a capricious, cruel young man disconnected from his father's philosophical ideal. The plague, by taking millions of Rome's subjects and soldiers, also weakened the very system that might have restrained a tyrant. Commodus was the opposite of a virtuous emperor. He believed himself a reincarnation of Hercules, fought in the arena as a gladiator, sold public offices to the highest bidder, and surrounded himself with flatterers and traitors. His government was so disastrous that many historians claim the plague opened the crack, but it was Commodus who shattered it completely. When he was assassinated in 192, the Antonine dynasty ended. And with his death began civil war, military anarchy, and the long decline that would lead to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. It was the transition from a golden age of wisdom, expansion, and order to an era of uncertainty, conspiracies, and ruin. Amid the darkness that engulfed the empire, one figure rose as witness, scientist, and survivor, Claudius Galen. Born in Pergamon, he was summoned to Rome by emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus just as the plague was beginning to consume the capital. Galen not only witnessed the disaster but also carefully documented the manifestations of the disease, describing symptoms such as high fever, diarrhea, throat inflammation, and skin eruptions with pustules. His medical work, written during and after the epidemic, became one of the most important pillars of ancient medicine. Although his knowledge was limited by modern standards, Galen was the first to separate the sick from the healthy and to recommend handwashing, centuries before the concept of bacterial contagion existed. For many historians, Galen was the first physician in history to face a massive pandemic with a systematic approach. His legacy endured for centuries. His books were studied for over 1,000 years in Europe and the Islamic world. But he also witnessed something else, how science collided with the superstitions of a civilization in crisis. While Galen analyzed symptoms, many in Rome still believed the plague was divine punishment. Thus, among corpses, prayers, and medical treatises, Galen became a symbol of knowledge confronting death, in an era when both reason and faith trembled at the same time. The Roman army, pride of the most powerful civilization of the ancient world, staggered before an invisible enemy. The Antonine Plague did not distinguish between peasants and centurions. The legions returning from the east carried with them more than glory, they carried death. When Emperor Lucius Verus died in 169, many suspected poisoning, but the symptoms were the same that afflicted his soldiers: fever, rashes, and rapid decomposition. Marcus Aurelius, devastated by the loss, was forced to make unthinkable decisions. He recruited slaves, gladiators, and criminals to rebuild the decimated legions. The plague had emptied the camps. Some historians claim the losses were so great that the Roman army stood on the brink of extinction without fighting a single battle. Right in the midst of this health catastrophe, the Marcomannic Wars began. A coalition of Germanic tribes took advantage of Rome's weakness to attack the Danube frontier. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher and warrior, had to delay his response for 3 years. There were not enough men. There was no strength. When he finally counterattacked, the emperor was not only fighting barbarians, he was fighting the echo of the plague, the fragility of an empire that believed itself immortal. Many soldiers, already infected, even spread the disease to the enemy tribes, extending the tragedy beyond Rome's borders. Thus, Rome's glory rusted to the rhythm of a war it could no longer wage as before. And although Marcus Aurelius died on campaign in 180, his legacy was marked by an empire that was no longer the same. Steel had yielded to the virus. The Antonine Plague did not only kill people, it also killed routes. The commercial arteries of the Roman world began to clot. The Indian Ocean, that vast highway of silk, spices, and precious stones, became a corridor of shadows. Historians like Rafe de Crespigny suggest that the plague may have simultaneously affected the Han Empire in China between 151 and 185. A coincidence too perfect, just as Rome and China were tightening diplomatic ties, the disease emerged. In 166, a Roman diplomatic mission reached the east. Did they bring a message, or did they bring the plague? The first documented case in the West was not in Rome, but in Smyrna, in Asia Minor. Yet the temporal proximity between the mission and the appearance of the virus has made generations of scholars suspicious. Although Rome never stopped importing silk and perfumes, the flow diminished. Merchants feared contagion, ports trembled at the arrival of foreign ships. Trade suffered, and with it, the very soul of the empire. For Rome was not only legions, it was a marketplace, an exchange, a cosmopolitan world. If once the Silk Road had been a living artery, now it was an open wound. The Antonine Plague was like an eclipse of global commerce. And although Rome would continue buying from the east, its splendor began to fade slowly, like the lights of a city extinguishing one by one as night falls. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180, not only did a life end, an era ended. The philosopher-emperor had held together, with wisdom and despite the plague, the threads of the empire. But his death left the throne to Commodus, his son, a man whose unbridled ambition, capricious cruelty, and delusions of grandeur set off alarms in Rome. Commodus was not merely incompetent, he was incendiary. While Rome was still healing from the plague, he immersed himself in bloody spectacles, proclaiming himself a reincarnation of Hercules, killing wild animals in the arena, and abandoning affairs of state to corrupt favorites. Under his rule, imperial authority lost its sacred aura. The Senate feared him, the people ridiculed him. His obsession with the cult of his image and his disdain for governance bled dry what little stability remained. In the year 192, Commodus was assassinated in his palace. He died strangled, as if the empire itself rejected him. With his death, the Antonine dynasty was extinguished, the dynasty that had given Rome 5 good emperors. What followed was civil war, a dance of generals, a bloody chaos that paved the way for centuries of fragmentation. The Antonine Plague, Commodus, and the subsequent instability were not isolated events, they were falling dominoes, one after another, heralding what historians would later call the slow collapse of the Roman world. Rome, though still standing, had begun to hollow out from within. Amidst the chaos, fear, and death, a solitary figure rode among corpses and laments. Galen, the most celebrated physician of the Roman world, was summoned from Pergamon to the capital when the plague broke out. It was the year 168, and the empire needed more than soldiers, it needed knowledge. Galen was no mere healer, he was a thinker, an anatomist, and tireless observer. Before the plague, he did not flee. He stayed. He watched. He recorded symptoms. Fever, diarrhea, pharyngitis, and on the 9th day, pustules. Those descriptions, centuries later, would make modern epidemiologists suspect smallpox. But Galen could not have known. Bacteria and viruses did not exist in his vocabulary, only gods, humors, and courage. What was extraordinary is that, without understanding pathogens, Galen applied measures that would save millions centuries later, isolating the infected, hygiene, handwashing. Simple ideas, but revolutionary for his time. A spark of wisdom in the face of ignorance. His treatises, such as The Method of Treatment, became the beacon of Western medicine for over 1,000 years. No wonder his name became synonymous with doctor. Galen did not save the empire, but he left something more enduring, the first systematic attempt to understand a plague through rational tools. In a world tormented by angry gods and ominous auguries, Galen was the voice of reason among echoes of death. The Antonine Plague did not only infect bodies, it corroded the very structure of an empire already beginning to falter. The legions, weakened by casualties, returned home with soldiers gaunt, afraid, and less capable of defending the frontiers. The provinces, unprotected, began to suffer barbarian incursions. But it was not only the enemy's sword that made Rome tremble. It was the silence in the forums, the shortages in the markets, the lack of hands in the fields, and the cries of the dying in alleys that once brimmed with life. The empire, accustomed to conquering with iron, did not know how to face an enemy without a face. Fear itself became a virus even more contagious. Every family that lost a son, a father, a mother, drifted a little further from the imperial promise. The idea of Rome as the eternal center of the world cracked. And in its place, a fissure opened. A fissure through which despair, superstition, and the longing for a new age seeped in. Many historians point to the Antonine Plague as the beginning of the end. Not with a great battle, but with a whisper of death that slid between columns and temples. Marcus Aurelius died exhausted, devastated not only by disease but by the weight of an empire slipping through his fingers. His son Commodus would reign over a still-warm corpse. His rule would be a symbol of decadence, waste, and madness, but perhaps all he did was inherit a legacy already doomed. Rome, the eternal, was no longer invincible. The plague did not only kill people, it killed certainties. And when certainties die, empires fall. Thus a new world began to take shape. One where faith replaced the old gods, where fragmented kingdoms sought meaning in the dark. The virus was not only biological, it was civilizational. And although Rome would take centuries to fall completely, the Antonine Plague was its first irreversible fracture. A fracture opened by the invisible hand of death.